our first question for the panelists is, in your work, how do you see the church as a dominant system? And what is not only your role, but your community's role in moving the church back to the alternative system that it once was? And why don't we start, Jen, would you be willing to start us? And then we'll move from there.
Yep, sure. So I think that MANNA is a real good example of this because of the fact that MANNA, which is the unhoused community and ministry of the cathedral, is such a good example of this because we exist right within the dominant system of the church. That and the way I want to frame that is that ecclesia ministry, which is the same population of people, is outside of the dominant system of an institution. They are a 501c3. They are their own entity, and so they function really differently than we do, even though it's the same community members. That within the system of the Episcopal Church, we are bound. MANNA is really bound to some of the I'm going to just call them sort of rules of the church, which makes the community itself of unhoused folks who suffer with the challenges of mental illness and substance use disorders more challenging for us as a community existing within that system. So I am a cradle Episcopalian, so I grew up in the within the the doctrines of the church and within the dominant system of the Church of the Establishment, predominantly white, wealthy community, and the community that I am the pastor to is completely the opposite of that. So we butt heads constantly with existing in a system and within the building of the Episcopal Diocese and the Cathedral Church of St. Paul. So every day when we enter the space, we are in confrontation with the norms of a dominant system and a predominantly white system. So it's not just the class clash, but also the race clash and the clash of systems set up to, unintentionally and intentionally keep those dominant systems in play. So, so that I would say is a good example of how we exist within a larger system. And in terms of how Natalie, what was the second part of the question, please?
The second part was how do you understand your role or MANNA's role in terms of moving us back to alternative?
Thank you. So, so oftentimes I will say it this way, that very basically there have been many times, I don't know that a week goes by that I don't say, should we be moving out of this dominant system? Because it's so hard to exist within it. It is so hard to exist within it. Just hitting the door is hard to exist within that larger system. So it would be much easier actually to be ecclesia ministry or to just go down the street. We used to joke that we would be MANNA Ministries, a storefront with a sign flashing MANNA Ministry, because it would be so much easier. But we all have always believed that the church needs us, that the church needs us, and we need the church. We need the church because we want to be part of the change of helping one another. That if we, when we feel marginalized by the church, then we realize that if we turn around and do the same thing to the church, that we are shooting ourselves in the foot because of the fact that we are then marginalizing the system, the dominant system that has the ability to change if we all work together.
Thank you, Jen. Helen, I saw your head moving when Jen was saying the church needs us. I think that, yeah. Do you want to share a little bit about what you do at Beloved Community and in terms of moving the church back to alternative systems and how that resonated with you?
Well, everything that Jennifer says lives in the person. lives in your body. And every day that Jennifer goes to work, it's like an assault on who you are as a person, who you are as an organization, as an entity. And so with us, what we try to do is to figure out, okay, here you come to us as an individual who exists in a community. How do we challenge that? How do we get you so you can get through the day? Because it's an assault, it's violent. And so one of the things that we try to do, or we try to figure out, is in terms of engaging with this thing, how do you also heal as you go along? Because without healing, we can't exist. We simply cannot do the work. And so the question becomes, how do you integrate those things? And so one of the things that we do at Beloved Community, because we have both Black and whites in our organization, within our group anyway, and we have a Black leader. I'm the leader, who is very African-centric in the way that I go through the world. And so for me, the church is a challenge every time I go to church. Every time I come to a Beloved Community team, I'm trying to figure out, okay, how can we disrupt this system so that people can begin to dismantle this thing within themselves? And so the first thing we've been doing since we've been on Zoom is we take everybody off of mute. Everybody goes off on mute. And that everybody is like, oh no, we can't do that because it will be too controversial. Nobody will know when to talk. You've got to tell us when to talk. And so, but the idea is when the Spirit moves you, let it move through everybody. And so we have to get beyond fear. And that seems to be with every time we challenge the system, we engage with fear. And people, and so we try to figure out, okay, how do you as a person deal with fear? Where does it reside in your body? Because the mind, we know about the mind. The dominant system teaches us about the mind. But how does it, your whole being, how does it come to fear? How do you interrupt it? And so we think about how you hold difference, and we practice how you hold difference. We practice and we try to encourage people to express strong emotions and to testify to what they're gonna do. How do you deal with conflict? And so one of the things that we also do is I come at it from an African-centric perspective from the jump. And so one of the things that we do is we ask people, just jump in, you know, do not hold back. And it's okay if you make a mistake. The Spirit will take care of you. We will be able to hold you if you make a mistake. And there's no such thing really, if we think about it, as a mistake. But we are afraid, again, of not doing things right, especially whenever we're dealing with white folks. It's like, how do you do it perfectly? And so I give you an example of what the things that we do. One of the things that I try to do is to use music and to use the arts to try to get people to challenge or to not be afraid. And so we kind of work with understanding that sound and that singing, as Bernice Reagan Johnson of Sweet Honey and the Rock says, that sound and singing can change your physical condition. And that singing is a way, and sound is a way to, if you run it through your whole being, it will challenge you. It will bring you into another way of being. And so, like I said, and the only way to do that is to jump into it. And so I will play some Black music for the group. And it is amazing to see how scary that is for folks, for white folks, to jump into just moving with music. The Black folks are like jamming around. You know, they're like, oh, okay, now we doing it. Yeah, let's do it some more, you know? And so it's invigorating for them to have their own sound reflected in an entity that is essentially within a church, that is within a dominant system. And so I continue to do that over and over again. And the white folks, you know, we deal with what is this sense of entitlement that they normally have. How is that challenged by having a Black leader who comes from an African-centric perspective? What comes up for you? And that is scary. Again, it's fear that we have to deal with. And so that
Thanks, Helen.
That is some of the ways that we respond.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I was really loving that image of you just getting people to jump in, and I could feel in my body the fear when you said everyone should go off mute. So maybe that's something I need to pay attention to. You know, lean into, right? Lean into. So what's the worst that can happen? Some background noise, right? So thank you, Helen. When you were talking about disrupting and dismantling the system by changing the way people are programmed as individuals, it reminded me of what Andrea has just talked about the role of UIA and MCAN of dismantling dominant systems. So I'd love for you to jump in, Andrea, and just talk about y'all's work. And if you can start with a really brief introduction of just what UIA is and what MCAN is for people who don't know, and then share about how y'all are challenging the church's dominant system.
Yes, thank you. Again, I'm Andrea Sheppard Lomba. I'm the director of United Interfaith Action of Southeastern Massachusetts, which works primarily in Fall River and New Bedford. So we're a faith-based community organization that works on social justice issues, garnering the faith communities of Southeastern Mass to work on justice. We're also part of a statewide network called MCAN, which I referenced earlier, the Massachusetts Communities Action Network. And that's a network of maybe about 7 other faith-based organizations around the state, based in Boston, Brockton, Lynn, Worcester, Springfield. There's also a youth organizing component in Boston. And we're all based around the same notion of working on social justice issues within the faith community. So part of the framework that we work from as a statewide network, we have this model about a house, and that we're living in this house. And the house has been constructed by empire. We're living in a house of a dominant system. So this notion of in this country, the house was built on a foundation of freedom, but also on the institution of slavery. So already the foundation is faulty in the house in which we're all living. And then we have this notion of the 4 pillars of the house. again, in which we're all living and breathing and operating. And the four pillars sustaining the house that we're living in is white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and what we call imperial Christianity. So in terms of our work of imperial Christianity, what that means is, the Jesus movement was co-opted in terms of how it began to move all the way, like with Constantine forming the state religion and then forward. And, all the way up to today, you have the Crusades and the conquistadors, where through history, even in the founding of this country, religion has been used as a pillar to create a moral approval of the dominant systems. Like you have the example back in 2018 of Jeff Sessions, where he's standing before the country reading Romans and saying the Bible gives us justification for putting kids in cages and separating families at the border because they're disobeying a law. And God says you need to obey the law. So the church has been co-opted and is now one of those pillars in this dominant system. And it's the moral authority justifying a dominant system. And as members of the church, we're participating in that. So I think part of the role of groups like UIA and MCAN and others on this call is trying to disrupt that and saying, no, we're living in this house, this dominant system, and it's costing us very dearly. And what do we need to do to start tearing this down and rebuilding a structure and a world and a community that God really intended for us? And as we all know, it's not easy work. So in UIA, we gather faith institutions to work on social justice issues, but right away, when I walk into a congregation and talk with the clergy or some of the faith leaders, they'll often say, oh, you're coming to divide us. You're coming to talk about politics, and the church doesn't do that work. We're a service organization. We're not a justice organization. And so we challenge them, we'll go back to the foundations of our faith. And Jesus was really a community organizer. And so we work with congregations in bringing them into campaigns of social justice action. So we're primarily challenging dominant systems in this movement ecology framework. So whether it's going to the State House and working with legislation around funding the $1 billion deficit in education that's primarily following on, the burden of low-income communities, or working in Fall River around a U visa policy in which the police, they were not signing U visas, which are for undocumented immigrants who come forward to report a crime against them. And it gives them potentially a pathway toward documentation if they agree to cooperate with the police in public safety. But the police chief and the DA, they weren't signing those U visas in Fall River. So we held them accountable to that, and they changed that policy and began signing U visas. Whether it's going to the superintendent and holding them accountable for a community budgeting process, our community advisory board around racial equity in our schools. So that's the ways that we're challenging the dominant system with communities. Or some examples.
Yeah, and it sounds like simultaneously challenging the church as a dominant institution to change and challenge other dominant institutions, so you're doing, you're changing the church, and in the process, you're also challenging the dominant system, other dominant systems. So yeah, really helpful. Thanks. Mark, I'm going to invite you to share. There's so much of what has been shared that reminds me of your work, especially people talking about, hearing their own voice in a dominant system and the work you do to shepherd the Indigenous communities in Canada. But if you just want to jump in and share a little bit about your work and then how you see your role in getting back the church back to an alternative system.
Thank you. We represent over 225 communities, mostly in remote areas, some in urban areas, about 65,000 Indigenous people. There are a few non-Indigenous people in some of our congregations, but for the most part not. we exist in a church that said very clearly up until not too many years ago that our goal for you is that you not exist. The goal is to eliminate you as a culturally and racially distinct group of people within our society. Now, those were the good guys. The other guys were saying, let's kill you all. So between those two choices, I suppose it's better for the people who say you'll disappear. But anyway, so the system was designed consciously, and remnants of that system are still in place to eliminate Indigenous people as a culturally distinct people. So the church was part of that process and saw as its goal getting Indigenous people to mimic Western ways of doing things. So the church said, your task, your goal here is to do it as closely to what we do as possible, and to eliminate any cultural expression that is unique to who you are and what you are. And now that was a colossal failure, and the missionaries constantly were complaining about Indigenous people not getting it, that the best thing was for them to disappear. Over time, alternative structures developed quietly, really under the noses of the missionaries, but that incorporated Indigenous ideas and ways of doing things with Christian ideas that, by the way, the Christian ideas were very attractive to Indigenous people. It was the wrapping that it came in that was unattractive. And so you find really true levels of Christian faith developing in Indigenous communities. And so you could say that one part of it has been to try to raise up those parts of Christian faith that developed as an alternative to the Western way of doing things. And that is a part of it. But the other aspect of it today is to decenter the church institutions. So the church institutions' authority were their capacity to mimic Western things. So what has happened is people have begun to say that the authority is based on the presence of Christ in the community wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together. That's important for a number of reasons. It says that the authority is in the community, but also it says that the church doesn't need all of the trappings of the church and the institutions of the church in order to have authority. So from an Indigenous perspective, the Anglican Church, which is very similar to the Episcopal Church, was a church that the poor could not afford. So that it required huge infusions of cash to support a plant, program, and clergy that was neither replicable nor sustainable. So they built these colossal things out in the middle of the remotest parts of North America, and then said, "Okay, now you guys pay for it." And so its stupidity is grand and can only be attributed to the maliciousness of their views towards Indigenous people. It would be considered cruel in another context. So we are in a church like the Episcopal Church, which, although it still has programs in poor areas, the churches have gradually eroded from those areas because people can't afford it. So it's what was, I think, a strategy to promote the Jesus movement became the goal of the Jesus movement to the way that the church operated. So you needed to have these buildings and these institutions. You needed to be a part of Western civilization. And when you couldn't afford them, well, the church didn't have any interest in you. Part of what we're doing is we're trying to establish sustainable church communities in areas that cannot afford a normal Anglican church. And so we are really focusing on what are the primary elements and constituents of a living community. And it's been very challenging. Now, we still have buildings in our communities, some left over, some built, but they become community centers. They're not just a place where a group of people meet on Sunday morning. So but in many places where the indigenous population is the fastest growing ethnic group in Canada. And so, and of course, everybody thought they would be gone by now. So it is a great surprise that in many places, the indigenous population, for instance, in Saskatchewan, by the end of this decade, it's predicted that Saskatchewan will be a majority indigenous province. That will have a huge impact on Canadian politics. And so we are in the midst of a revolution, but it's still rough going. And we, again, I would say this process of decentering authority, de-Westernizing, decolonizing authority, and creating communities where the focus is on individual discipleship in community. I would say that is critical. Individual discipleship in community, that this is the basis of what we hope to be, what we plan to be, a revolutionary presence, not only in our church, but in our society. We are dealing, I would last say, so we are dealing with conditions. We are, our people are the poorest people in Canada. They have the highest rates of suicide, of death by violence and accident of any group by many factors. And so these are the challenges, but we also believe that we can be a positive presence in places that still are plagued by policies that and practices by government and church that are meant to displace and eliminate Indigenous people.
Thanks, Mark. So across the board, each of you really talked about that the system was designed to kill us, you know, in different ways, that the system itself is designed to kill us. And if we're talking about strong emotions, Helen, I think owning that feeling of the system was designed to kill us and really claiming that. So then the question becomes, which is quite ironic because the church itself is supposed to be a life, you know, the origin of the Jesus movement is one to find life and to save our lives and to find liberation. So I'm going to pose one more question to all of the panelists before we go into small groups, and I'd ask you just to answer it briefly, as briefly as you can, so that we can have time in smaller group discussions. But what, you know, not all of us are, some of the people on this call are existing in churches that look more like the dominant system than the alternative system, right? You know, and so what do we do? And, you know, Mark, you just talked a little bit about individual discipleship. You know, what do we do in our own contexts to save our lives? you know, and save one another's lives?
I think the first thing, you know, that as I listen to Mark speak and I listen to what you're saying, the first thing is truth telling. It does kill folks, literally. It will kill you. And there's no easy way to say that. And for us, the support or how we deal with it is admitting that and trying to figure out, how do you heal as within that paradigm, within that statement? How can we heal as we go along to give us the strength to challenge this thing that could kill us? How do you live in your families? You know, because that is your immediate support system. How can they help you not get killed?
Yeah, I would just follow that, Helen. You know, I echo what you're saying, and I think that we can't do it in our own echo chambers, that we have to be in relationship with one another, that in the context of our own being, that it's about, you know, that ecology of movement, that it takes other parts, that we can't do it ourselves, that we will be killed if we try to do it without being in relationship with other people. That my understanding of beloved community is that it takes all of us. It takes all of us. That and that truth telling, you know, will be detrimental. And but we have to be in relationship with one another. And I believe that God is relationship, and through the Spirit, that that being in relationship, that there will be death and loss, but life on the other side of it.
Yeah. And, you know, not to take up time again, but the first thing that we look at is we do try to support people who are doing the work within their families. How is it that you're going to deal with your mom, your dad, your kids? Can they help you? What's going to happen to you? Because many times it does challenge your relationships, your immediate relationships, as well as, like what you're saying, Jennifer, not being alone, not feeling alone in the work. We really do need each other.
For us, I would say that we have come to believe that God has chosen to hide wisdom among the poor. And we have only to look to what the rich are doing to the United States to see the truth of that. And so it really is a matter of trusting that our grandmas know more about what is true and right than the experts do. And this does not mean we're hostile to experts. It just means that we give privilege to the voice, particularly of grandmothers. That's most of our societies were matriarchal. Most of them were matrilocal. Most of them were matrilineal. The church tried to erase all of that, but we're trying to bring it back. And so we are looking to, we believe that we believe that the systems of this world that are mentioned in Romans try to obscure the ever-present wisdom of God in creation, and that creation is not some kind of empty place where we try to dream up good things. its wisdom is still present to those who have the mind and heart to see. And I think we're heavily invested in seeing our Christian faith embodied in Indigenous life, culture, wisdom, and law. So that's really our goal is to become Indigenous communities of faith.
Thanks, Mark. And Andrea, what about you? What would you say? How do we save our lives? How do we save one another's lives right now?
Yeah, so I would agree with what's been said before. We talk about in our trainings in UIA and around MCAN that in the beginning is the relationship. It's a quotation from Martin Buber in his book I and Thou, and that as long as you exist in isolation, you're never going to really be able to build that beloved community. And to be able to hear and empathize with other people's experiences. So we always begin with the relationship building piece and the community building piece. But I think also in that, we also have another saying that's the first revolution is internal, and that it's not just enough to get to know others and to hear where they're coming from and to empathize with their lived experiences, but we also have to challenge ourselves. So we hold trainings asking people to figure out, where are you situated in this house we talked about in relationship to white supremacy? Where are you in relationship to capitalism, to patriarchy, to imperial Christianity? Because if we're not able to face how we're part of the dominant system ourselves, and we're not willing to have an encounter with ourselves to change our own hearts and minds, then our work to change the dominant systems around us is going to be very weak. So we have a lot of intentional trainings that then move into trying to create alternative systems. So around the MCAN network, different affiliate groups are kind of experimenting with cooperatives and creating economic alternatives with cooperative businesses, cooperative learning centers, where the community's owning and investing, getting the dividends from it, reaping, from their own investment. So we're beginning to grow into trying to form some alternative systems, particularly around cooperative economies.
Great. Thank you. So thank you each for sharing about the work that you're doing.